Hey guys, welcome back. We are starting a new solution today, so download the starter solution using the link in the video description down below. That'll give you a zip file which you can unzip, change into that directory inside of the terminal as I've done here. You're going to have some files and folders that have been expanded from that zip file, and you're going to go ahead and run npm install to install your npm dependencies for the solution. And you can go ahead and run code space dot to open this up in Visual Studio Code and simultaneously run npm run start to boot this up in your browser. And you will see in the browser, this is an app that we're creating called Slider. And as you have probably guessed, we're basically going to transform the simple HTML content that you see here, which is some basically 3 pictures with some text and a call to action on each one. And we're going to transform that into what you could consider a horizontal slider. Some people would call this like a hero or a carousel. There's lots of different words for this type of component, but the idea is you're going to have kind of like 3 different slides that can slide left and right, and they're going to be stacked horizontally and will allow users to kind of pan through them to see different things. And I think this is a nice component. It's a little more advanced than what we've done in the past. The sortable that we created in previous lessons was pretty advanced, but this one is also in its own way sort of advanced, and in that it's going to have to consider the experience of pointing events and users with a mouse cursor versus users with a touchscreen very differently. And that's going to kind of introduce some new challenges. And it's a very typical thing you may experience when you're creating drag and drop functionality and things where you can kind of slide things and do swipes and stuff like that. This is the basic functionality you're going to need to be able to do all sorts of those types of functionalities, especially on a touchscreen. So we're going to introduce all of that into this component that we're calling the slider, and we're going to kind of start from scratch so you can see the whole process and exactly how a slider works at its most basic level. But before we jump in and start adding all of that fun stuff, let's take a look in Visual Studio Code at the solution that we are working with. You will notice you have, of course, a source folder with index.html. This contains all of the HTML for our solution, which has an app.sas file that you can open. The only thing this does is import a slider style, which you'll see, whoops, can't command click that one, but you'll see over here slider is just an empty SAS file. So we're going to kind of, again, start from scratch so you can see exactly how that's going to come together. We also have down here on the main page area, we have the slider HTML itself, which essentially just consists of a div with a class of slider and then an unordered list or a bulleted list that contains the slide. So each list item in our bulleted list, you can see there's actually a bullet over the left here. Each one of those list items is its own slide. And that would typically be how I would expect to see the HTML of a sort of a carousel or a slider component, is that really when you think about it, it's a list of things, right? It's a list of slides in this case. And so for that reason, we're putting it inside of an unordered list, but certainly the HTML structure is flexible and you could do whatever you wanted. But in this case, we'll use this structure with an unordered list. And then each list item or each slide contains an image, a heading, and then this div with a class of slide content, which generally contains a paragraph and a call to action, which is just a link that does nothing. It just reloads the page when you click on it. And you can sort of see that inside of the browser window. If I click on this, it just reloads the page, doesn't actually do anything, but there's 3 different slides. Again, so we have our oranges, we have our avocados and our strawberries, and we're just gonna, first of all, just do some CSS work to make this look a lot less like a bulleted list, like it appears now, and a lot more like a horizontal slider area within our app frame. We will jump in to our slider.sas file here. And let's utilize the CSS classes that we just saw in the HTML to do some basic stuff. So first of all, we'll take the slider itself and we'll set a background of darker. I usually like to create kind of a background color behind the slider itself. We'll also set On the dot slides, which we can use our inspector here to take a look at this, but you'll see the unordered list has a class of slides, which again, this is an unordered list, so it's a bulleted list. And just like with our sortable in the previous exercise, we can take our slides and we can remove its sort of bulleted style using 3 different styles, which are margin 0, padding 0, and list style none. So if we add those 3 styles, you see it goes back to a very simple unordered list with no bullets and no margins around it, which is looking better. And then within each slide, we have this image with a class of slide image. So we can style that up as well. We can say slide image. And let's basically take that image, which by default is an inline block element, and we'll make it display block and width 100%. So it fills the width of its container, which will remove the left and right scroll bar at the bottom, as you can see. So no matter the size of the frame itself, which is this app frame, if it were to change its width to 7 or whatever, the images are always going to scale. So it's going to be a nice responsive slider as well, which is what we want. And then typically with a slider, you would kind of expect to have this background image, and then this content would kind of be displayed on top. So what we can do is we can take our slide or each individual list item, the slide itself, and we can say position relative, and then we can absolutely position the title and the slide content on top of that. So for example, we could take our slide title and we could do position absolute, top 0, left 0, right 0, like so. Let me sort those. And you'll see that positions the title on top of our image for each one of these images. And we'll do the same thing for this slide content div. So we'll go down here and we'll go to slide content. It's going to be position absolute. But this time we'll do bottom 0, left 0, right 0. And now you can see the images are stacked right up next to each other and we have content on top. We'll take our title and we will set a color of lightest, and we'll do the same thing for slide content, like so, to make sure that they have more contrast. And because we have a dark background behind the scenes, we can actually set on our slide image, we can set opacity to like 50%. And you'll see it kind of darkens the image because it's blending with that dark background behind our whole slider element. And it's just giving our text a little more contrast. But still, if you had like a really light image in the background, this text might be hard to see. So normally something I would do as well is on your slides, you could add a text shadow. And that could be something like 0, 2 pixels, 4 pixels, transparentize, darkest, like 0.6 or something like that. So it's kind of hard to see, but it adds just a little drop shadow behind the text to give it a little more contrast, especially if it's a really light background image. That's going to help us get a nice contrast on that text, so it's nice and visible. And you can adjust all this, based on the photos you have. You could come in and change the opacity like 0.25, and you'll see it'll get a lot darker. You can change it to 0.75 if you want a little more emphasis on the photo. It's totally up to you with what you want to do there. But we'll go middle of the road there. We'll do 50% so you can kind of see the photo and the text on top. And I think that's looking good. So let's also bump up the size of our slide title. So we'll do like font size 3 Let's go really big, 4 Make it a big old title on top there. That makes it easier to see the text shadow, doesn't it? On top of that. Let's sort that up there. And I want to make sure that this is centered. So we'll do text align center. And let's give some padding around it. Not only do I want to make sure there's padding on the top, but also on the left and the right, just in case it's a longer title. I don't want the words going right up to the edge here. So we'll just add some padding to this. We'll do padding is 50 pixels on the top, 50 pixels on the left and the right, and 0 on the bottom. And you'll see when I hover over the slide title over here, you can kind of see the yellow padding box that goes around. So the text will always stay in the blue area in the middle. You also notice the orange bottom, and that's because by default, a heading has a bottom margin, or at least in our style sheet it does. So we can also set in here margin to 0. I don't know that that's actually going to do anything because it's position absolute, but I just like to clean it up so we can see very clearly where our content could appear in each one of these titles. That's looking good. Let's do the same thing to our content down here, our slide content. We'll add some padding to that. So we'll do padding is 50 pixels on the left. Sorry, 0 pixels on the top, 50 pixels on the left and the right, and 50 pixels on the bottom. Top is 0, right is 50, bottom is 50, and then left will be 50 because it'll repeat this one. Just want to make sure I had that right. So now you can hover over slide content and you'll see it gets its same little padding box there to kind of space these things in the middle, which is looking good. We could also do a text align center if we want to, certainly optional, but everything else is centered in this app. So I think that gives it some continuity. It's looking pretty good. And let me also take the paragraph within slide content and let's bump up the font size on that. Paragraph, because it's kind of a lead paragraph style, if you will. So font size can be like 1.25 ems to bring that up. And let's bring down the font weight to a really light font weight. You'll see that lightens that up quite a bit, but it's nice and big, and that's looking pretty good. Just some visual updates to give us each one of the slides kind of a nice aesthetic to it. And that's going to be kind of configurable for each app, I would say. The style of each slide, totally up to you. This is just one example of how you could do that. There's lots of different ways to do this. You would have to, in this case, worry about like the overflow, like when you go down to really small screen sizes, you want to make sure like if this paragraph is really long, it's not overlapping your title. It's just kind of going to depend based on what content you want on your slide. Sometimes it's just images, sometimes it's a lot of text. And so that's totally up to you, how you want to style each slide. But the idea is that each slide kind of has this same style and it follows this same thing like we've done here. And we now have 3 individual slides, which are rectangles that by default, because they're an unordered list, are going to be stacked on top of each other. But again, the idea of this slider is I want to create a horizontal scrolling slider, if you will. I want to be able to move it left and move it right and kind of pan back and forth. And what we can actually do in order to accomplish that is this unordered list with a class of slides. We can basically take this and we'll set a display flex. So we're going to use flexbox to make it horizontal, which if I save here, you see is going to totally jack everything up. So that's looking great. Let's call it done. No, not really. We're not going to call it done just yet. We do need to fix that. So what we want to do in order to fix this is on the slides, we want to do something like set the width to equal the current number of slides times 100. So in this case, 300%. And you'll see what that does is it takes each one of those slides and it makes it the full width of our screen here, of our page. But it's actually, you can see it's kind of creating this horizontal overflow, which we don't want. So what we can do to fix that is on the slider itself, we can set width 100%, overflow hidden. And by doing that, I don't get a horizontal scroll bar. I can't see the content that's over to the right, but we have a horizontal flex box. And then what I can do in the CSS over here for this unordered list, we could go and add, and I'm just going to play around with this to show you what we're going to do. We could say position is relative, left is 0% by default, but then as I increase or decrease this, notice how it's panning. Right? That's the mechanism that we're going to use to actually pan through these items. We have an unordered list with a width of the current item count times 100%. So 300% in this case because we have 3 slides. And then we're going to take that and we're going to change its left position to be up to a negative 200% to see the last item. Right? So that's kind of how we're going to move back and forth. So again, let's copy that in here. We'll say position relative left is 0% initially. And we can even add a transition on the left of ease. So if you add a transition, you'll notice here, it's going to create an animation, right? A transition. So if I go from left 0 to left negative 100, look at that transition. If If we go back to 0, you can see it kind of animates over that. If I go to 200, it does the animation. So immediately, by really not doing a whole lot other than setting display flex, we kind of get a lot of those features of a slider that you would kind of come to expect. But obviously, we need to make it so that this happens not when I'm messing around in the dev tools, but actually when I'm interacting with content on the page itself. And that means, of course, JavaScript. So in the next lesson, we're going to be creating a new web interaction component for our slider that will essentially give the control of this left percentage value that's on our .slides HTML element. It's going to give control of that value to the user through some sort of controls that we create that are going to allow them to pan left and right. And the script will actually be manipulating this left percentage value to allow users to navigate back and forth. So we'll take a look at that in just a moment.